And so now I'm going to introduce Kate Callahan, who's an MD from the Stick Center and also the Internal Medicine Department and Division of, or Section on Geriatrics. And here's Kate.
Thank you. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce my friend, Louise Aronson. She is going to be talking with us about what we talk about when we talk about aging and how stories can help us reimagine aging. And I just briefly wanted to say that this is deeply meaningful to me because stories are why I am a geriatrician. Getting to learn about my patients' lives is a privilege and a wonderful opportunity. So Dr. Louise Aronson is a geriatrician. She takes care of homebound older adults. She is a writer, and she's a professor of internal medicine. She's the chief of geriatrics education at UC San Francisco and directs their Medical Humanities Center. She's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and also of Asheville's Warren Wilson Program for Writers, and she's been nationally recognized as the Gold Professor in Humanities and Medicine. She's received the Alpha Omega Alpha Professionalism Award, and through our American Geriatric Society has been awarded the Clinician Teacher of the Year in 2013. She wrote the book History of the Present Illness, which has been read by the Medical Humanities group and many of us here as well, and was a finalist for a national award for that work. Her work has also been published in medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, Health Affairs, The Lancet, also in Narrative Medicine, and also in New York Times and Washington Post. I'm particularly excited about her upcoming project, which is focusing on the experience of aging. Finally, I'd like to give a particular thanks to the Humanities Institute, who has hosted Dr. Aronson while she's here. Is Mary Foskett here? Thank you so much. All right, and without further ado, Dr. Aronson. Oh, yes, and her book is here for sale, History of the Present Illness. I highly recommend it. Thank you all.
Lower this a little after Dr. Callahan. Thank you very much to everyone here for coming, and maybe particularly to Kate Callahan and Mary Foskett and the Christinas and the whole team that has pulled together this incredible day. It's been a pleasure to be a part of it. So I'm going to, we've heard a lot about science and a lot about different arts, and I'm going to pull them together just a little bit. The key point of this lecture is this slide, which I'll show you several times. And I hope to convince you that it's true, that the greatest limitations of aging come from our imaginations and our policies, not our physiology. So just think about that. So I took this very long title for this talk from a book of short stories by Raymond Carver, a great American writer of the last century. And he wrote What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And that's an interesting thing. And what he was trying to get at was all the ways we talk about it, right? Love is a big topic. Well, aging is a big topic, too. And there's a line in the story that has the same title as the book. It says it ought to make us feel ashamed when we talk like we know what we're talking about when we talk about love. And a lot of people claim to know about old age, right? Old age is bad. Or if you do this and do that, then you can have it your way. And they really reduce this big, complex, interesting, fascinating human animal into something very small. So another key message is aging is a really diverse thing. It's actually the single most diverse time of life. You take one 8-year-old and a bunch of other 8-year-olds, and they are almost all of them fairly identical in developmental stage. Same with 45-year-olds. But you start getting towards 70 and 85 and 95, and you have much more variety. So there's not a single story that captures aging. So there are also a lot of books on aging. This is one segment of my bookshelf. And then this is what happens when you search. And really it goes on and on and on. So I did a kind of crazy thing which was I did a variety of searches. I searched popular sites, I searched medical sites, I searched literary sites, and I made a list of all the books on aging that I could find, of all types, the literary, the technical, everything in between. And then I alphabetized that list, and then I sort of looked at it to see what are some themes. And I was initially just going to give you the themes, but I actually decided it was more fun to read you some of the titles. And I want you to think about the themes on your own, and particularly think about the themes of this conference. We've got mobility, mind, including memory, mortality, and meaning. So think about those, but also think about what else you hear. Okay? I'm going to read it now. Ageless, aging, aging well, an absent mind. At 70, at 82, at the end of the day. Age doesn't matter unless you're a cheese. Not a bad title, right? Being mortal, the big shift, a bittersweet season, blue nights, the blue zones. Can't we talk about something more pleasant? Coming into the end zone, coming to terms with aging, composing a further life, conscious living, conscious aging. Dare to be 100. The denial of aging. Don't ever get old. Elders rock, ending aging, enjoy old age. Finding meaning in the second half of life, fit at any age, for a good old age, forever young. French women don't get facelifts. That can't be true. Generation reinvention, the gift of years, growing older without feeling old. How to be old, how to live, how to prepare for old age, how to retire happy, wild, and free. How we age. I feel bad about my neck. I feel great about my hands. I'm too young to be 70. Journey into simplicity, knocking on heaven's door. The last gift of time, lighter as we go, living longer for dummies. Living with purpose in a worn-out body, long life secrets, long bright future. The mature mind, the measure of my days. My mother, your mother, my twice-lived life. Never grow old. New life, no instructions. Old age is always 15 years older than I am. Old age and how to survive it. Old age is not for sissies. Old age is a terminal illness. Get this one. Old folks at home, warehouse them or leave them on the ice floe. Parents with Alzheimer's, patrimony, rethinking aging. Second wind, senior moments, the sexy years, slow dancing with a stranger, so you're 70, sod 70. That's sort of screw 70 in British English. Somewhere towards the end, staying afloat in a sea of forgetfulness, still here, suddenly senior. The thing about life is one day you'll be dead. The third chapter, this is getting old. Unexpectedly 80, the unintended journey, unretirement, the upside of aging. We know how this ends. What are old people for? What comes next? Who cares about old people? Why survive? A widow's story, winter journal. The year of magical thinking, you're only old once, younger next year. So did you hear some of these 4 themes? And what other things did people hear? What sort of negatives? You have some fear. You're gonna die. This is the only country in which that's news. Humor, yep, there's some good humor. There's actually a huge number of books about taking care of older parents. There were some in there. There are many more. Very beauty conscious, yes. More aimed at women than men, but that's true at all ages, I suspect. Sexuality, yeah. And that's sort of good, actually, because I wasn't sure it would be there. Should be there. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, there's some incredible titles. Okay. Well, there are many more, but that seemed like a long list. I had trouble pruning. It's not one of my strong points. Anyway, so when we talk about aging, we tell a lot of stories. Two of the stories we tell most commonly have to do with what it's like to be old. And one story is that old people are frail and ill and dependent, and they're going to pull us all down, and it's a very bleak story. And the other story is that you can eat your blueberry and kale, and you don't even have to get old. And getting old will be fun and terrific, and you have complete control over that process, right? Both of these stories aren't really true. And in fact, in most lives, you're going to experience a bit of both, perhaps hopefully more of the latter than the former. But so this is all of us. It's not that there are some seniors who are more successful than others. This is the lifespan, and it has variety even within the category we think of as old age. So you've seen a version of this slide many times. And the reason I like this one is that it seems a little more true to our experience to me, right? So when we talk about childhood, right, we have a lot of words. We have the newborn, the infant, the toddler, the child, the tween, the teen, and the young adult. And at this point, right, they're like 19, right? And you look at this map or you look at life, if we're starting to count old or aging that has significant impact on your life at 50, and we know people routinely now live into their hundreds, not all of us obviously, but increasing numbers, then that is a span of maybe 60 years. So why is it we have 6 terms for something that happens over 18 years, and one word, or actually a series of sort of interchangeable, not very popular words, for this entire spectrum that is old age? So one of the things that we need to do a better job of talking about when we talk about old age is to discuss the distinctions of the different stages of aging. So this is an early computer. Does anybody remember these great big computers? When I was in college, the first experience I had with a computer, I had to walk across campus, and there was an engineering building, and it was a room shaped a bit like this, only 3 times bigger. And the computer took up most of the room, and it went the length in both sides, and then there were these little terminals up on a balcony, and you could go use the terminal. If you looked like these guys, you were probably programming it, and if you looked like me, you were just using it for word processing. But when computers were first started, people really thought it was just for engineers, just for a certain sort of techie person, and probably just Western people, and probably mostly male people, right? And that it would be very useful, but it would be confined to a certain segment of the population. And they tried to make them better, right? So that this is a little more portable, certainly. It's still not very attractive, and a lot of people still weren't using it. This is circa 1980. And then this guy came along, right? And he said, it doesn't have to be that way. What would happen if we took computers, these big, bulky, ugly things that most people think they have no use for, and we made them useful to other people, to many, many people, and we made them attractive to those people. And we actually thought about what is it those people need and what appeals to them. And just because something's useful doesn't mean it has to be ugly. Think of some of the things we do in houses to make them safer or easier for older people to get through, right? Does much design go into that? No, it's just functional. People just hammer holes and put up ugly things. Well, Steve Jobs, right, I don't think would have put up with that had he had the good fortune to live into old age. So he said it doesn't have to be that way. And I would argue that the same thing is true of aging as is true of the computer. Okay, so just reminding you, the greatest limitation is our imaginations and our policies. If Steve Jobs can do what he did for the computer, we can do stuff for aging to really improve it. And there are people trying. So this is the first of several reports by a group called the Frameworks Institute. Frameworks has a MacArthur grant for doing good work in the community. And what they do is help people with messaging. And they're working with the 8 biggest aging organizations to rethink how we deal with aging. And they found some pretty interesting things. It turns out that people have 5 prejudices. Actually, I can't go backwards. 5 things that they bring to aging that are misconceptions. The first one is that aging is all bad. It's completely negative, which we know not to be true. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is that when we talk about the successful senior, we reinforce that it's bad, right? Because we're saying that's the exception. So when we talk about aging, we need to be careful about things that increase the perception that it's all bad. Another thing where people mean very well, 70 is the new 50. We're giving people more life and better life. But what you're saying in saying 70 is the new 50 is that being 70 isn't okay. Right? We all age. So one of the most important messages you can give people about aging is all bad is actually, no, aging is something we all do. It's simply a life stage. Normalize it. It's just one stage of life. In theater, they use 3-act plays. This is the 3rd act. It's essential to the whole, right? It defines the whole. You take out any one of those acts and the play makes no sense. Okay, the second thing is the boomers are a demographic blip, right? There's this crisis, it's a silver tsunami. But that's not true at all, right? It's actually a change. It used to be most of us were young. Dr. Olshansky talked about this yesterday. But now, most of us are getting older. So the boomers, if you look at that, at the bottom is young people and at the top is old people. So it used to be triangular, right? Very few old people, lots of young people. And now you see this thing coming out, but it's not just a bulge, right? It's not a little midlife extra weight, and those are the boomers. It's that it's changing. The subsequent generations are also bigger. Our entire population is shifting to be an older population. And we can take advantage of people's experience and make it easier for them to participate and for all of us to participate as we get old if we recognize that this is the new normal. It's not a tsunami. It's not an aberration demographically. It's the new normal. What can we do to make this a great new normal? So the third myth is that aging is an individual problem, right? And this is a little complicated because it is true if you exercise and stop smoking or don't smoke, your chances of a better old age go up. But it's so much more than that. What enables us to exercise? Well, is there a safe place where you can go outside and walk? Or is there transportation in your community that can get you to a place where you could exercise? Those are policy level and social decisions. It's not an individual problem. So this evening, it so happens that my high school is having a reunion, and my class it will have graduated 35 years ago. And so we're all in our early 50s. And someone started, it's a group of, I honestly can't remember how many of us, but it's something like 60 or 70 of us. And someone started summarizing the last 35 years. And so everybody's been sending emails, basically 4 paragraphs on what happened to them in 35 years. And what is something that every single person so far has mentioned? I'd say about 55 people have sent an email. Everyone has mentioned their aging parents and the struggle to take care of them and having to figure it out on their own. Because the way we have set up this problem is that it's all our individual problem. And we all need to just buck up and deal with it. And that's a myth, because we could have institutions that would make it easier for us to deal with these things. We have pregnancy leave because it's very hard to deliver a new infant and show up to work the next day, right? I mean, we have policies about things already. We just need to think about how to do that for old age as well. It's not an individual problem. And it's not all a problem. It's a challenge, but it's everybody's challenge. And the fact is that if you can help people, think of all these adult children who then aren't going to work or aren't helping their own children because they're doing things that we as a society could make easier. So we're losing a lot of productivity and a lot of opportunity by making what is a policy level issue an individual problem. It ends up making it us versus them, right? Those old people, pushes them out of the way. We are doomed, nothing will help. So this just pulls out of the other. If you think you're doomed, what's the point in trying, right? So this is a really dangerous message. And we know it's not true, right? We see programs that enable people to make a huge difference or changes people can make on their own with support. So this is simply not true. We can make things better. And then ageism is invisible. This picture, I think it will come up. It says best by, I think, June 1973 or something like that. People are allowed to say things about old people that they would never say about other people. In the medical context, it happens all the time. People roll their eyes. I had a medical student who was interested in geriatrics and was doing her core surgery rotation. And in the operating room, the surgeon was teaching her. They were having a great time. And he said, "So what do you want to go into?" And she said, "Well, I'm thinking about geriatrics." And he spent the next 3 hours saying, "Doctor, I'm constipated. Doctor, I'm constipated." He did not teach her one more thing. Can you imagine? You know, would he have done that about a person of color? Would he have done that about a woman? Would he have? Not possibly. And that's just one, you know, and you can say he's just a bad apple, but I could sit here for, you know, until probably Monday and tell you other stories. Okay. So when even the best meaning people are making these mistakes, right? I've made each of the mistakes, right? The successful senior. When we communicate and things aren't getting through and people think we're doomed and there's nothing we can do, then what we have is a communication problem. And one of the great ways to deal with a communication problem is through stories. Framework's most important finding was probably that when we talk about old age, we tend to tell incomplete stories. And when you don't finish the story and get to the desired place that you want the person to be, the positive outcome, the opportunity for change, where you want them to be thinking when you finish your story, they will fill in with their prejudices. So they will fill in with aging is all bad, or there's nothing we can do. You must tell the complete story. So for the rest of my time, I'm actually going to focus on stories and how we might do that better. So why tell stories? We've heard a lot from doctors and research scientists with some really great evidence. But it turns out stories have some advantages, and the two shouldn't be competing. Does anybody know who this guy is? Oh, the picture? Stalin, right? It's really good in the middle of a sunny afternoon to bring up a genocidal dictator, I find. But Stalin actually knew something about stories that we sometimes forget. So he said, 1 million deaths, one man's death is a tragedy, and 1 million deaths is a statistic. So a tragedy people remember, they talk about, they care. But 1 million deaths, it's harder for them to pay attention. This is a photograph of a little film that a guy named Paul Zak shows. Paul Zak is a neuroeconomist. So think brain and money, right? An interesting juxtaposition. So he has people come into his lab, and they answer some questions, and they have their blood drawn. And then they watch this little video, and then they have their blood drawn again and answer more questions. And what happens in the video is this. It's a video of a man who's looking out a window watching his son. His son is 2.5, and his name is Ben. And Ben's outside playing, and he's looking really happy, and he's giggling, and it's adorable, but the father doesn't look very happy. And then he tells you why. And he says, well, Ben is really happy because now he's finished all his radiation and chemo, and for the first time in a year, he really feels good. But the dad isn't so happy because he knows something that little Ben doesn't know. And what he knows is that his son is dying. So this is very moving, right? And the story goes on, and the people have their blood drawn again. And they're given $20 for participating in this study, and on their way out, they are asked if they'll donate it to sometimes it's just a random stranger for no particular reason, and sometimes it's a charity for kids with cancer. Now, when they've tested these people, they've found a couple of things. People have one of two big reactions, or sometimes both, to this story. Some people feel distress. And there's a hormone like it's our fight or flight hormone, or one of them called cortisol that goes up. So the cortisol goes up and they're really distressed by this story. And other people feel empathy, and there's a hormone called oxytocin that goes up. Well, so who do you think gives the most money? The people who are feeling the distress or the empathy? Any votes on that? Okay, so I'm hearing empathy more. That was exactly what I thought. Well, it turns out the people who are most likely to give money have high levels of both. Because what does distress do? Not so much distress that you're completely devastated and can't do anything, but a certain amount of distress in a story gets people's attention, right? It sort of wakes you up. You know, I was droning on about the different themes or whatever, but you start hearing about this kid with cancer, and more people perk up and pay attention. And then if you feel something for the father and the boy, you feel the empathy, those two things together. So a very powerful story, a story that gets people to give money, but think of giving money as a behavior. So a story that gets people to change their behavior, their voting, how they take care of themselves, etc., is a story that elicits some distress and also some empathy. It's a very powerful combination. And he and others have studied this in many different ways. What makes a story effective? Stories are also powerful because they recruit more parts of our brain. So if you give different groups of people the same information, and one group gets it just as facts, and the other group gets it as story, the group who gets it as story will have more parts of their brain light up. They will remember it better, and they will remember it better in 2 weeks' time. Even in your brain, depending on the story, the sensory motor part can be activated. It's like when you read a good story or you see something and you feel like you were there. So story is effective because it evokes more of your brain. You're more likely to remember it. Now, it doesn't mean if you're trying to convince someone of something, you make something up that isn't true. But if you have something important to say, to tell it as a story so that people hear it better and remember it better and link it to that thing you want them to remember, that's going to be way more effective. And we think we know why based on what happens in the brain. Now, at the other end of this, people have discovered this practically. If I tell you about an entire country of people who are starving, most people will tune out fairly quickly. They've done this with people watching television. So it's a story about an entire starving nation. People tune out. You start talking about one family that's starving, and more people stay tuned in. You get down to a couple people, just two, maybe two kids, a parent and a child and a grandparent, and you get more attention. But if you reduce it from the 2 to the 1, you get exponentially more people paying attention. The story of one person is the most powerful means of communication. And you'll see people using this. Politicians will use it, marketers will use it, the Olympics uses it. It will tell you the person's story so you care more and remember better. So stories are very effective. There's also the difference between our response to information and story. When people hear information, they're like, oh, I kind of get that, and I'm going to file it away now. When you give it to them in the form of story, it's more meaning-based, and the emotional and cognitive are linked. So they think, aha, I really understand that, and I understand how it pertains to me and what I can do about it. So it also changes how people respond. All right, so there are things we don't necessarily want to talk about with aging. We don't want to fall down too often on the successful senior. We don't want to talk about doom and gloom. We don't want to make it about this demographic aberration. What do we want to do? We want to say this is a stage of life and that we all experience. We want to talk about the variety. So how do we tell some of these stories effectively to make a difference on aging? Because yes, some people tell stories publicly, but we're always telling stories. It's one of the first things parents do with children. And if you go to an event, people will be telling each other their stories. So we all do this. One thing to do is to think, what's your goal? Do you just want to have people feel empathy? So one of the first, I guess maybe the first op-ed I ever published was in 1999. And I was doing house calls then also. And driving between my house calls, I kept hearing the same program. And it was an interview with a biographer called Edmund Morris. And he'd written some very good books. And he had just then completed a biography of Ronald Reagan. So your politics aside, he's going around, he's getting a lot of press, he's talking about Reagan. And he's talking about Reagan in the past tense. Does anybody know what year Ronald Reagan died? All I can tell you is he was alive in 1999, right? So this guy was so uncomfortable with Alzheimer's that he used the past tense, and that made me furious, right? So I wrote this piece, and all I wanted people to get out of the piece was that this is a human being who's alive, who has people who love him, and I wanted them to feel empathy for people with dementia and the people who love people with dementia. And they didn't have to learn anything about dementia. But I wanted them to come away feeling like it's not okay to talk about someone who's alive using the past tense. The next thing you might want to do is build awareness. I'll actually show examples of each of these things. And that just might be an issue that people don't know is a problem. And you can do this in all kinds of contexts. So in medicine, and we kept hearing the other day about heart disease and cancer and stroke, and we all know those are bad players. But if a person is over 80, falling down is at least as bad as those. And most doctors are taught nothing about falls. So sometimes we do some teaching or some talking to people in the health professions just to make them aware. And then hopefully once they're aware, we can do some teaching or some advocacy for people with falls. So I'm going to show you a few examples. So this was the one about Reagan. So what happens when you just want to raise awareness? This is a piece I wrote when I had an interesting experience which had to do with one of my dogs. So the dog got to be very old, and he had dementia, and he had frailty. And we decided he would get palliative care. He was a very old dog, and he'd had a good life. And then little things kept happening. Like he'd get a little eye infection. Am I going to put him to sleep for an eye infection? No, so in he goes, right? Then another time he had a little trouble breathing. Okay, so this is it. So in we go, and they say, well, he just has a pneumonia, we'll give him some antibiotics. Ooh, well, I guess antibiotics are okay. And yes, this was my dog. It's way easier to make a decision about a dog than a human being, but it gave me insight into something I had never really understood, which was that sometimes I had families where people loved their aging parent or spouse very, very much. And at some point they started making decisions that weren't necessarily in their best interest, and I couldn't understand how that happened until it happened to me. So I just wanted to raise awareness, my own and maybe other people's, about sometimes you're doing things for all the right reasons. And sometimes that's right, and sometimes it's just confusing, right? Okay. Teaching people. Dementia is obviously a huge topic, and we had a couple episodes in short order in our hospital that were concerning to me. One was a patient I saw on a house call. I had trouble getting in. I finally got in. She was very clearly having a heart attack and had been, so I called 911, and she was taken to the emergency department. I told the paramedics what was going on, and then I got another emergency call. So I took off across town. This was in August when almost everybody was on vacation but me. So the first person goes to the hospital, and usually I call and I explain, but I had a second crisis and I didn't, but I had told the paramedics, so I figured they would tell. But it turns out there was, just as they arrived, there was this huge accident on the nearby freeway. So they were asked to turn around really quickly, and they forgot to give the paper and the sign out about the person. So this woman had sort of a moderate dementia where she was socially charming and lovely. She couldn't tell you what happened 5 minutes ago, but you couldn't necessarily tell there was something wrong with her just on casual conversation. So she's there, and they say, "What's wrong with you, dear?" And she says, "Well, I guess I've been having a little stomach upset." But she's just, she's at the hospital. She has to tell them something, so she probably made that up. So they check her out, and she looks pretty good, and she's put in the hallway to wait because it's very busy. It was just one of those crazy days, right? So she's in the hallway waiting. And then somebody comes by and says, "Are you okay?" And she says, "Well, I feel hungry." So he said, "Oh, I'll get you a sandwich." So they give her a sandwich, which is really nice when people are hungry, except for that when they're having heart attacks, we usually don't give them sandwiches because we have to do things to help them where it's bad to have food in your stomach. And eventually I finish with my other emergency, and I call in and I explain what happens, and they figure out that she's been sitting in the hallway, and they put the EKG on, and sure enough, she's having a big heart attack, but she had dementia. And they didn't think that this fairly disheveled 80-something-year-old person, it didn't cross their mind, even though the rates of dementia are very high and there was no one with her. And this sort of thing happens in variations too often. So if you don't have someone with you, we need to change the culture where one of the earliest things we do is establish, is this person able to tell me what I need to know? So that's one thing about dementia. Then something else happened in the same week. I had a 101-year-old who had a little pneumonia, went into the hospital, and did really well quickly and was ready to come out. So the resident calls me and says, well, what should we do about this, this, and this? And I said, well, what does he want to do? And the guy laughs. And he says, come on. And I said, well, what do you mean? What does he want to do, Mr. X or whatever? And he said, well, we can't talk to him. He has dementia. And I said, he doesn't have dementia. What are you talking about? And then we make sure it's the same guy, and sure enough, it's the same guy. Well, guess what? When he went in, his daughter was worried that he would lose his very expensive hearing aids, so she took them home. So whenever they talked to him, he had no idea what they were talking about. So he just sort of try and answer as best he could, but I guess his guesses weren't quite on par, so they thought he had dementia. He didn't have dementia. He was in great shape. He lived alone and, is still doing that successfully a couple years later. But he could not hear very well. So you can see how sometimes you just need to teach people. And a story about a mistake, a heart attack that sits in the emergency department, untreated, really gets their attention very quickly. I could give them statistics about old people and heart attacks, and they don't have the symptoms other people have. And they'd say, yeah. And they do the same thing. But now they tell this story about the lady who sat in the hallway. Finally, advocacy. So this was a piece on silver architecture, which happened when I took my own father, who was in his later 80s and quite frail and had dementia, to a clinic appointment. And this medical center had built this very fancy, gorgeous new building. It was entirely green. It was winning awards for this. They had spaces for healing and all recycled materials, and it was fantastic. It was all over the newspaper. The architecture critic was writing about it. So we're really excited to see his doctor, who's moved there. And I get there, and in the first place, there's one handicap parking spot on this very busy street that has 3 lanes going either way, and there's someone in that spot. I go around a couple times, that someone is still in that spot. Then I go around another time, and they come out, but someone else went in. So at this point, we're going to be late, right? So I double park, and then I get him out. But people are honking, there's coming by. I've got the walker, I've got him, and I walk inside, and it turns out the clinic is, farther than that exit sign. And there's one bench. And the bench is flat and there are no arms on the bench. Right? So I get him safely seated, and then I say, just wait for me here, I could be a while. And I hope that works. But for the same amount of money, they could have put in a bench with arms. There are decisions we can make at the policy level which would enable people to get safely in and out of new buildings. And the way we think about the environment is great, but we need to think about the human beings too. If it's a big exercise center, most people can get upstairs to it. But if it's a clinic for frail people, maybe that should be on the first floor where they get to walk some, because exercise is great, but don't have to walk as far. So that first lesson was think, what do you want from people? Do you just want them to feel something about a category of person they generally write off? Do you want them to be aware of a problem? Do you want to teach them more about that problem and what to do about it? Or do you want to ask them to do something in particular? Secondly, make them care. So I love this story. This is a piece by Atul Gawande, the surgeon writer. And it was an article about death. And this was shortly after Sarah Palin and her death panels. It doesn't mention that. But it starts with Sarah Thomas Monopoly was 8 months pregnant with her first child when her doctors learned she was going to die. It is the rare person who hears about a very pregnant new mother who's dying that doesn't care, right? So right away he gets people's attention. Now who dies usually? Well, thank goodness it's not, very pregnant 32-year-old women usually. It's a shame we have to, but we do, and if we do, we generally would like to do so in old age, and most people who die are in old age. But imagine if he had started, Sarah Thomas Monopoly was 94 years old, with metastatic cancer and end-stage Alzheimer's disease when her doctors learned she was going to die. You know, the impact is somewhat different. And there are still people who will read that, but they are fewer. So sometimes use one story to get people's attention, and then embed other stories to really make your point. You can't make any points that matter if you don't have people's attention in the first place. And the story that will do that may be slightly atypical, but you want them to know by the end that that's atypical. Mostly we are not worried about very pregnant women with metastatic cancer. But we are worried about people with metastatic cancer, most of whom are middle age or older. So get people's attention. Make them care. Know your audience. Right? So if we go down to a little tech conference and we start talking about hospital care for older adults, they're not necessarily going to care unless we mention the technology options. You know, I'm in startup land, so we have to speak their language, and then the aging gets worked in. Similarly, how you communicate, right? If you want to reach people in their 20s, should you put an ad on the evening news at 6:15? Not so much. So thinking about your audience matters. Getting personal helps. The real true story, right? This memoir craze, reality television, people like real stories. And if you have the courage to tell your story, that's very powerful. Don't overuse data, right? When people recite statistic after statistic after statistic, lots of numbers, all people see is a forest. If you want them to see one tree, just give them that tree. Single statistic. Confidentiality really matters also. If you're going to tell someone else's story, you either have to change it in such a way that they can't recognize themselves, or you need their permission. Jargon. Jargon is especially true for the professionals. We all have this language we use, but all of us have a type of jargon, and that's called cliche. And when you use a cliche, people are turned into abstractions. So try not to do that. Try to really tell individual details. What did that person look like? What was the one thing they loved doing? And then be generous. This is a picture of Diane Meyer, who is a geriatrician that has sort of transformed palliative care. If people have heard the words palliative care, it's in no small part because of her. She wrote a piece last year, I think it was, about a patient with cancer who came to see her because the cancer doctor couldn't really talk about the end of her life. And this person had outlived most people by a long shot. She'd done much better than expected, but she knew eventually she'd die. And so at some point she comes in and says, she has metastases in her brain. She comes in and says, the doctor wants me to do this special treatment. And Diane says, I haven't really heard of that. Let me give him a call. So she calls the guy and says, will this help? And he says, no. Right? And she has this moment, and this is where the generosity matters. So instead of thinking, this idiot, what could you think? You could think this guy's an idiot. You could think he just wants to make money because people are paid a lot of money to do chemotherapy. Or he's just avoiding the issue of her death. You could think all these things. And instead she asks, and what she realizes is that he really cares about this woman. They've had a very long relationship because she did so well. And he doesn't want to abandon her. But the only thing he's really trained to do is give this chemo. And he wants to show her that he's still right there with her, and he wants to keep treating her. So he offers the next thing he has to offer, even though it won't help. Right? So generosity is seeing that the guy didn't do it for bad reasons. He did it because he needs training in some other skills, or he needs a team that can really help this person through the totality of her disease. But trying to see the other perspective, especially when things make you really angry, is tough but really helpful. Anticipate pushback, right? If you're making a case for aging, what happens if people say, okay, but there aren't enough dollars and we have to give it to kids? Right? You need to be able to anticipate that. Or I have a friend, a similar thing, who does work with aging prisoners. And people say, my gosh, the people who haven't committed crimes aren't getting good care, and you're going to work on the prisoners? So she has to anticipate that. There are some people that will care about aging prisoners because of human rights beliefs. And there are others who won't. But if you say to those people that the older prisoners are eating up a colossal and growing percentage of the prison dollar, and the prison budgets are getting to be enormous. And actually, if we provided better care, those budgets would go down, allowing money for the people who haven't committed crimes, as well as helping the lives of those who have. That's, you have to anticipate. Some people might say we shouldn't be helping older prisoners. In fact, this will help all of us. So bringing it to all of us really helps. To be sure is a good way to start this. To be sure, some people will argue. And finally, showing Trump's telling. So I'm just going to close by reading the beginning of a story that happened to me. So when I say personal, it can be you, it can be random things that happen to you, it can be your friends. I'll just tell the beginning of this story and then tell why. So the clinic was in a dilapidated old building located down the hill from a recently renovated hospital, yet the entryway retained a worn grandeur. Tapering semicircular walls extended like welcoming arms from either side of the sliding glass doors, and a half moon of sidewalk stretched to the quiet street. That's where I first saw her. She stood at the curb with her cane propped on her walker, squinting toward the nearby boulevard. Must have been about 4:30 in the afternoon then, as I'd asked for the last appointment of the day for my pre-op for a minor foot surgery, and I was about to be late. The woman was clearly well into her 80s with a confident demeanor and clothes and hair that revealed an attention to appearance and at least a middle-class existence. She had a cell phone in one hand and seemed to be waiting for a ride. This was just before Christmas, so when I came back out after 5, night had fallen. But for her tan winter coat and bright scarf, I might have missed her standing in the shadows, leaning against the curved wall. She still held the cell phone, but now her shoulders were slumped and her hair disheveled by the increasingly cold evening breeze. I hesitated. On one side of San Francisco, my elderly mother needed computer help. On the other, our dog needed a walk, dinner had to be cooked, and several hours of patient notes awaited my attention. I asked if she was okay. She answered yes. I waited. She looked at the ground, lips pursed, and shook her head. No, she said. My ride didn't come, and I have this thing on my phone that calls a cab, but it sends them to my apartment. I don't know how to get them here, and I can't reach my friend. She showed me her phone. The battery was now dead. I called for a taxi with my phone and helped her forward toward the curb. She was cold and tired by then, and suddenly seemed frail. We chatted as we waited. Her name was Eva, and she owned a small business downtown, or she had. She was in the process of retiring, having been unable to do much work in recent months because of illness. She'd been hospitalized twice in the past year. Nothing catastrophic, she said, yet somehow the second stay had dismantled her life. Things had never quite gotten back to normal since then. The geriatrician in me noted a few things, a little trouble seeing, trouble hearing. Just skipping ahead a little. So finally the cab arrived. The driver watched as I helped Eva to the curb, an awkward, slow process because of her cold, stiffened joints, the walker, and our bags. As I turned to open the back seat door, he sped away without his passenger. I stared dumbfounded and pulled out my phone to call the company and complain. Eva was more sanguine. It happens all the time, she said. Just then a taxi from another company turned the corner. He slowed down for my outstretched hand, but saw Eva and screeched off into the night. Damn, she said. It didn't take a rocket scientist or even a geriatrician to figure out why taxis didn't want to pick up Eva. It sort of goes on, but anyway, so finally I say, I'll give you a ride. And I basically refrained in that because this is the United States, and I thought, well, what happens if something goes wrong and I get sued? But finally you had to do it. Anyway, so I say, I'll give you a ride, and her face lights up. Oh no, she said, I couldn't have you do that. So we get her in my car. We drive to her house. It turns out that she lives up 3 flights of stairs. She can barely walk. So 40 minutes later, I got her up into the house. And in the meantime, we had a chance to get to know each other. And it turns out she got her care at my institution, which just yesterday, U.S. News and World Report again ranked as the 3rd best one in the country, and the only one that tops the list in both research and primary care. But her life was a disaster. So she'd had 30 visits in the past year. She had a bunch of specialists she saw regularly, lots of care, lots of medications. And at the end, I said to her, hey, you know, I think we might be able to do better. Can I look at your chart? And she let me. So I looked the next day. And it wasn't that her doctors didn't know her or didn't care. Actually, all her diseases were very well managed. But her life was in shambles. That's what she told me, right? So there's managing diseases and then taking care of people. And what she needed was to be taken care of. There's also, and we heard from one of the researchers this morning, what counts, right? Diabetes counts, but inability to walk doesn't, right? High blood pressure, which you can't always feel, and it's not that diabetes and high blood pressure aren't important, but if you think going outside is going to make you wet yourself, you're probably not going to go outside, so that's important too. Anyway, her doctors meant well, and they'd noticed all kinds of things, but nobody had done anything about it. And I'm just going to read one last bit, and then I'll stop. Right. Let's get that one. Okay. I know most of Eva's doctors. Each one is compassionate, smart, and dedicated. Indeed, her diseases were largely under good control. Yet Eva's health was declining, she was missing appointments, and she was less and less able to care for herself and her apartment. Several of her clinicians recognized this, but none took action. This was not because of personal or professional failings. Most physicians would have taken the same approach to Eva's care as these doctors did. Their actions and inaction were the inevitable result of their medical training and our healthcare system's sometimes narrow focus on medicine at the expense of health. So this was an advocacy piece. It was a random story. This wasn't a patient. This wasn't a relative. But it made me realize that here were these people who were really good doctors, taking what's considered the best care of this person, and her life is ruined. And that's a story that can tell the story of what our field does better, right? And that we need more geriatricians who think more about the person and what they can do and less about the diseases and organs. But equally important, maybe more important, we need to make sure all people who take care of older people in healthcare settings have that same approach and attitude. So that was the reason for that piece. Showing often trumps telling, and then there's a story that sticks those messages in people's minds. So we got Eva onto our geriatrics program, and she remains in her house and doing very well. She actually does not want to move away from the steps, so at some point had to transfer to house calls, but she doesn't have to waste all her energy and money. It's something like, I have it in here, but it was several $100s each way to get her up and down the steps. And she'd worked into her 80s, but that was going through her savings. So we all have a story to tell. Each and every one of you has many, many stories, and I really hope that you will start telling them about aging, because it's only through effective storytelling that we're going to change the conversation, what we talk about when we talk about aging. You heard those titles, right? It's either you don't have to do it, or it's ugly, or you can redo it, or you'll have dementia. There are so many different stories that reduce it to falsehoods and things that scare people. So there are real challenges, but as with every single other stage of life, there are tons of opportunities here for everyone so that we can all make good use of our entire lifespan. And I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. What would it take to get you to move to Winston-Salem?
You have really great people already. So I should say that when I started in geriatrics, I hadn't heard of Wake Forest, but you'd have to live under a rock not to have heard of Wake Forest these days. In geriatrics, you have incredible people.
You're right,
now.
we do. My other question is a silly one, I guess. You had a cartoon, and I couldn't read the caption.
Yeah, I was getting concerned about time, and then I realized it was kind of medical. So in the medical arena, there's something called HIPAA, which is the Health Information Protection Act, right? So you can't be telling people other people's private information. Although the month this past, I was at a nursing home counter, and one of my colleagues was yelling into the phone, "What do you mean you can't tell me about her? She's my patient!" So the hospital nurse wasn't willing to tell him anything. Anyway, so the cartoon caption says, HIPAA, no, it's not a female hippopotamus. You know, so yes, you do need to know. It's not just a female hippo. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk. I heard three things that interested me, and I'm wondering how they intersect. One is the paucity of geriatricians and the need for more well-trained ones. Another is what I heard as doctor bias in some cases in medical schools toward people who are interested in going into geriatrics. And then the third is the importance of storytelling. And I guess what started turning in my mind was, can storytelling be used effectively in medical school settings, or in, for that matter, undergraduate settings, to encourage more people to train in geriatrics? And I wondered if you had experience either doing that or ideas about how it could be done.
Great questions. Sort of two big topics. I guess I'll take maybe the last one first, which is that we know stories can really change behavior. There are actually great data on people with arthritis being able to function better from writing, with people having better blood pressure control, et cetera. So writing can be very helpful and can sway people. Could storytelling get more people interested in the old? I don't know. It's certainly worth a try. There is a field called narrative medicine, which helps us tell and interpret stories within medicine better, but it's much broader than that. It's an interesting idea. It's hard to get stories into the data-filled medical curriculum, though some people have had more success than others. The issue of how we get more people to do geriatrics is, of course, a really important one, and something lots of people are working on. And again, it's a bit like making things individual. There are big structural problems. So in the third year of medical school, people have to do core rotations, right? It's to expose them to all the basic specialties. So they'll do surgery and pediatrics and medicine and psychiatry and neurology, all the basics, so they get a sense of what those are. Well, those turn out to be the same specialties that we had them do a century ago when most people were kids. Lots of people delivered babies. Now, once people are doctors, only about 3% of them ever deliver a baby again after medical school, but we all learn how to do that. How much time is required for geriatrics, do you suppose? Yeah, very few schools require it. Many schools have none whatsoever. You know, so again, and if you look in hospitals, about 6% are kids and about, well, of healthcare, yeah, so maybe 20% at any given moment are older. And these are conservative estimates. In some hospitals, it's 50%. And 6% are kids. But people all do 6 weeks of pediatrics and no geriatrics. So that's where this policy level thing, if it were national policy to reflect not just demographics of who's alive, but healthcare usage. Let's train you to take care of the people you're actually going to take care of. That would make a big difference. And then I think we in geriatrics need to do a better job of telling our stories. So it's our organization was one of the ones that is working with the frameworks people. We also, you know, we were the ones initially doing palliative care or thinking about different settings of care. And now that's sort of seen as elsewhere. And in some ways that doesn't matter, right? As long as people get good care, that's the most important thing. But I think we also just need more geriatricians and more people who even aren't in geriatrics to understand what's different about the older body. Because the fact is we all know they're different. And different isn't necessarily bad, but different needs to be acknowledged. Just, you know, if you give the same medicine to an 8-year-old, a 48-year-old, and an 88-year-old, the dose is usually calibrated on the 48-year-old, who will probably tolerate it just fine. But you can make the 8-year-old and the 88-year-old really sick in different ways. So we know these people are different. Why are we treating the 88-year-old the same way as the 68-year-old, as the 48-year-old, as the 28-year-old? It flies in the face of common sense.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I really appreciate your stories about the diversity of aging and how we're looking at a population that's so much more diverse in so many ways than other life stages. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about LGBTQ populations and what what even greater diversities come out of caring for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks in the later stages of life?
That's a great question. And that's actually changing. So there are a variety of shifts as as you get different generations. And as we've talked about, old age is a really long period, so we have multiple generations. So in the older LGBTQ patients, a lot of them were in the closet for most of their lives and may still be. So they don't tend to access services as much as other people, and it requires a different sort of outreach because they're scared of prejudice that they felt throughout most of their lives. They also are more likely to be isolated and maybe to have engaged because of this chronic discrimination in harmful behaviors which can affect health over their lives. Younger, sort of later baby boom generation LGBTQ are much more actively involved. But there are unique issues. I'm sort of hoping that with time and the huge social changes lately, that's going to happen. I think there should be less and less difference. But currently, we need to ask and be ready for the right answer. I actually was forever changed during my intern year where they had taught us to ask, do you have sex with men, women, or both? Really impartially. And I thought I was pretty good at that. And then I asked this young woman, and she gave an answer that was completely different than what I had assumed based on what she looked like. And I had this reaction, which wasn't necessarily negative, but I was clearly completely shocked. And I feel like that interfered with her ability to trust me and talk to me. And so we need to learn how to, even with older adults, and this happens if older adults are asked about sex, right? Because, well, most people don't ask in the first place. But when they get asked about sex or sexuality, people expect a certain answer, and when they don't get it, they look surprised. So I think we need to do a lot of training about asking and really wanting to know the answer and understanding the variety of answers, and then the special needs of unique to people in different groups, including LGBTQ.
The story about Eva brought to mind patient advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
She obviously did not have a patient advocate. Is there any sort of program, excuse me, to develop a bank of patient advocates for elderly folks?
That's a great question. So there are navigator programs now. It started with cancer to help people through all the treatment and all the different places they had to go, and they have a variety of those programs now. If you look up an elder navigator, though, what you get is mostly for-profit people, which isn't to say they're not going to be helpful, but there's a little bit of a mix going on, perhaps. And then there are lots of organizations that work with older adults who will serve a sort of informal navigator role. Sometimes it's because they do transportation, but the people who do the transportation are so nice and they get to know the same person and take them places and go with them. But we really need a national network, yeah. Right. Oh, yeah, like the CASA program, yeah. But in fact, you don't necessarily need to be old to need a navigator for our healthcare system, so this may be a larger problem.
That comment actually is a little bit related to my question. Several times today I've thought about the concepts of universal design, and when it comes to architecture, just the reality of how helpful it is for everybody, not just an older adult or someone who's differently abled, and how interesting it is when we think about our society. What if we saw kind of universal design in other elements as well, that it's better for everybody, not just someone else. But that just made me think about that as well, just making it regardless of your age.
Well, and if we just got used to it, and that's what I like about Steve Jobs as an example, right? Because some of those things people say, I don't want them here because it's aesthetically not pleasing or not interesting. But it doesn't have to be. Handles could be artwork in their position, in the materials of the wall versus what you're using for the thing to hold on to. We all might use it under different circumstances. You know, you get a rock in your shoe, and if you're wearing heels, then, you know, it's sort of nice to hold on to something if you're not a dancer, like some people. So there are many circumstances in which those things would help all of us. And also, if they were pleasing, you'd start to look for them, right? I mean, in San Francisco, we're very green, and you can tell which buildings are using the fancy new materials and which aren't. People look for them and talk about them. And you could start doing sexy things like that about aging, too, and about universal access. That really is the failure of policy and imagination, I would say.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's thank Louise again. Mm.